Thanks for having us.
You are very welcome. Okay. So as people are coming in, thank you for everybody who is coming on in. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Derek Smith. I'm a career strategist with the Academic Advising and Career Center, and this is our Exploring Management Pathways event. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening tonight and who's here and all that. So we're going to be doing a bit of a panel. This is being recorded, by the way, so just let everybody know that we are recording this for future students who wish to watch this but couldn't make it tonight. So before we kind of jump into what the whole night is about, I do want to introduce you to what are coming up, some of the events. So tonight we're doing the economics event. And then we have 3 more of these events coming up if you're curious to find out more about different areas of management. So human resources is next week. We're doing that brand new IT double degree session coming up on March 3rd. So if you want to know more about this brand new program, started just about 2 years ago, you're more than welcome to check that out. And then we're going to wrap up with finance on March the 10th. Now, another conference that's coming up I do want to let you know about is the Academic Advising and Career Center is running a conference from April 27th to 29th, and registration begins on April the 1st. So this 3-day conference, I will be coordinating and hosting that as well, is a 3-day crash course in how to find a job after graduation. So if you're a 3rd, 4th, you're an alumni student and you're like, I got to think about work and how to find a job, this conference is really designed for you. So we have it advertised starting in the beginning of March, and then the week of April 1st is when we're going to go ahead and start the registration for that. So do check that out. We're going to be doing 3 networking events with alumni and actual recruiters who said they'd be willing to hire, will be coming and joining us through those 3 days. So a little bit about who I am and the services available to all UTSC students. So again, my name is Derek Smith. I'm a career strategist with the Academic Advising and Career Center. So you may or may not know this as a management student, but you have a career center. You have career services available to you. Now, as co-op students, if any of you are here at co-op tonight, you do understand you do get some career help, but for those who don't have or are not in co-op, you do get dedicated career services. So just to let you know, at the ACC, we do provide one-to-one appointments. We do resume critiquing and resume helping. We do some job search help as well. Interview preparedness along with mock interviewing, some career exploration. A big thing right now is LinkedIn. I've been told by some recruiters that during this day and age and within COVID, if you're not on LinkedIn, you're not really existing. So we do LinkedIn help as well. Any kind of career strategic questions you might have. So please feel free to book appointments with us. We do one-to-one appointments. I am one of many career strategists that can definitely help you out. But what I want to do first is introduce you a little bit to our panelists and who is joining us here tonight. And then we'll do a bit of an introduction to what economics is all about. So let me introduce our panelists to you. First, I want to present to you Professor Ambrish Chandra, who's an associate professor of economics at the University of Toronto at Scarborough. He's also cross-appointed to the Rotman School of Management and the Department of Economics. His academic research examines competition and public policy in a number of industries, with particular emphasis on the airline, automobile, and newspaper industries. His recent research is focused on how to travel and trade across the US and Canada border, a response to exchange rate and changes. His opinion pieces have been featured in the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star, and he just got his PhD in economics at Northwestern University in 2006. So welcome, Professor Chandra. Vivekan is a UTSC alumni who spent the last 4 years learning about and facilitating sustainable, inclusive economic development and system change. His experience spans from NGOs, community organizations, multinational corporations, and now at a boutique consulting firm. He specializes in market systems development, strategy advisory, and monitoring and evaluating in agricultural and tourism sectors. Welcome, Vivekan. James. He graduated from UTSC's management in the inaugural Management and International Business program, the MIB program. He completed a master's in international finance and development from the Social of Oriental African Studies at the University of London. His experience varies across multiple types of organizations, from NNCs, public sector organizational government, national level NGOs, social enterprises and international agencies, and across multiple continents, including Europe, Africa, and Asia. Career focus over the past few years have been on international economic development, prioritizing financial inclusion, digital finance, developing countries, inclusive market development, economic empowerment, and social enterprises. Finally, we meet with Jeff. Jeff currently serves as Director of Organizations at Cortland Credit Group, a Toronto-based assessment manager. Jeff is responsible for originating new alternative financial investment opportunities for the Cortland platform, as well as conducting due diligence of potential investment opportunities. Jeff has spent more than 15 years of industry experience, most recently in a similar role in a Toronto-based hedge fund. In addition, Jeff has held positions at several boutique investment, asset management, and wealth management firms. So welcome to all of our panelists. So we're going to look about what economics is, and I'm going to hand this over to Professor Chandra. Oh, you're muted there, Professor.
Sorry, still haven't learned after all these months. Thanks, Derek. It's great to be here, and thank you, Derek, for organizing this event. I'm going to spend just a short period of time telling you, or reminding you, I guess, of what economics is as an academic discipline, give you a little sense of pathways in terms of careers in economics, especially on the academic side, remind you a little bit about what the big picture is with respect to coursework at UTSC in economics, and then I'll hand it over to our great alumni, because I'm sure they actually have more interesting things to tell you about their lives and their jobs. So let me just pull up a short, just pulling up a slide deck. Sorry, I should have, this is not a computer on which I guess I've enabled permissions for sharing something, so just bear with me 1 second.
No worries.
Okay, that should do it.
Yes, we can see it.
That's great. Sorry about that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just give you, like I said, a short overview of economics as an academic discipline at UTSC, and some career paths that might be open to economic students. So in these few minutes, what I'm going to do is just briefly go over what the discipline of economics does, what the objectives of coursework at UTSC, economics coursework at UTSC, involve. Many of our economic students, so many of you are, going through these courses right now, but it's easy to lose sight of the big picture, right? When you're focused on individual courses, there is a big picture. We've put a lot of thought and effort into designing coursework to meet an overarching goal, but sometimes, you lose sight of that. So I'm just going to remind you of what that is. And then I'm going to give you a few examples of how economics research is used to answer questions in academia and government, and then briefly mention career paths open to economics graduates, especially for those of you who end up staying in academia or going into related fields like in the government or think tanks and so on. Okay, so the economics is divided into 3 standard areas. This is sort of something that I'm sure everyone here knows, but let me just remind you what we call micro, macro, and econometrics. And traditionally, the field of economics, ever since the time of Adam Smith, a couple of 100 years ago, has traditionally been based on models of the world. Economists or social scientists used to observe the world and then develop models, basically theories of how they thought people behaved, or people or firms. But in recent years, really in the last 20, 30 years or so, there's been a huge shift towards empirical work, that is work involving data, because we actually have the data now to observe the world more systematically and to develop more formal models of how people and institutions behave that aren't just based on observation, that are based on hard data. And so, as you've already seen in economics classes, the basics of economics involve understanding trade-offs, right? Every decision, every policy decision, every decision by individuals involves some kind of trade-off. You give up something to get something. It may not be explicit in your own minds when you're making these decisions, but it's there at some level. And so these trade-offs or this cost-benefit analysis is the heart of economics. And what economics emphasizes in particular are things like incentives, so how people respond to incentives, and what we call marginal analysis. That is, any decision we make has an impact on the margin. There might be marginal benefit, there might be marginal cost, and trading off those marginal effects is the heart of economics. Okay, so that's just a reminder of what economics does. Screen for some reason isn't advancing. Let's just try this. Okay, so at UTSC, we have certain learning objectives that we want all our economics graduates, not just our economics specialists, but even the BBA students or anyone who's a non-specialist in economics, to ultimately come away with through the core and through the specialist classes. These are our learning objectives. There's actually more of them, but I've sort of stripped them down a little bit. Fundamentally, we want students to understand the economic way of thinking. Okay, so how do economists think? Economists think in terms of trade-offs, in terms of how every action or any decision has competing trade-offs, benefits and costs. We also want students to ultimately understand how markets operate, how individuals or firms within those markets interact with each other. Very importantly, we want to understand the role of government in these markets. So, we live in a market economy in Canada or, in the United States or Europe. These are fundamentally market economies. We let private decision makers make decisions. Whether you think that's good or bad, that's just fundamentally how these economies are organized. Yet the government has an important role to play. So what effect does the government have? Understanding that is a critical learning objective. And finally, something fairly recent, but something we're really emphasizing now is quantitative reasoning skills. So the ability to use and analyze and develop understanding of large data sets is something that we really emphasize now more and more. Okay, so that's something that some of our econometrics classes in particular tend to emphasize. Fundamentally, economics is a social science, like other social sciences such as political science, sociology, anthropology. Economics is also a social science. We're different in the sense that we tend to focus on issues around markets, around the price system, around the allocation of goods and resources. And economics is also on the margin between the social sciences and business. So of course, economics gives you the tools to understand finance, marketing, all of the fields within business. And one of the things, it might be a little chauvinistic to say, but something that economists love to say is there's nothing you can do with a degree in finance or marketing that you can't do with a degree in economics, but the reverse is not true. Now, of course, I'm sure some of my finance colleagues might disagree, but that's really, we think of finance and marketing and even accounting as basically being applications of economics. If you fundamentally understand economics, you can understand all of those fields, but not necessarily the other way around. All right, so I'm not gonna, just in the interest of time, since we have 10 minutes, I'm just gonna go through this quickly, but one of the things in terms of macroeconomics that you've already seen, macroeconomics focuses on the big picture, on the large questions, the questions all around us, questions affecting the entire economy. So things like unemployment, interest rates, for example, the big economic issues like the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 has really spurred a lot of research into the causes and the consequences of such a big event like that. And there's no doubt that COVID-19, once it's finally done and over, the economic ramifications of that are going to be enormous. We're already seeing that. And that's really what macroeconomics is going to do. That's one branch of economics. It's not the biggest, though. The biggest branch of economics by far is microeconomics. Microeconomics, which is my own area, itself spans a bunch of subfields. So there's industrial economics, which focuses on industries, urban economics, which focuses on the size and the growth of cities, environmental economics, that's of course self-explanatory. What are the tools we can use to improve environmental outcomes, trade, theory, labor economics, and finally real estate economics. These are just some of the subfields of microeconomics. And fundamentally, microeconomics studies individual people or firms or decision makers, as opposed to macroeconomics, which focuses on the larger picture, the overall economy. That's the basic distinction. That's why microeconomics has these different subfields, because you can choose to focus on these different areas individually rather than trying to link them all together in the big picture that is macroeconomics. I'm not going to go through all of these fields. What I thought I'd do just for a couple of minutes is give you a sense of a couple of research questions that emerge from some of these fields. So I'll give you 3 quick examples in 3 slides. Here's an example from a colleague of mine here at U of T. It's a very simple question. Did highways cause suburbanization? Okay, so the fact that North American cities in the US and Canada saw a huge increase in highway building in the 20th century. At the same time, we saw a big increase in suburbanization, that is a large increase in the size of suburbs in metropolitan areas at the expense of cities. Were those 2 things linked, and did one cause the other? And so my colleague Nate Baum-Snow actually looked at this and he said, yes, to a large extent, highway construction caused suburbanization. The fact that you could drive into cities using these interstate systems or using the Trans-Canada Highway or the 401 from far off enabled people to live much further off, and therefore drew population away from cities and into the suburban areas. Now that might seem obvious to you, but actually we didn't know for sure that was true. The reverse might have been true. It might have been that policymakers anticipated that people would want to live in the suburbs, and so they built these highways. But that's actually not the case. Nate studied using data and using historical evidence that in fact it was the latter, that highway construction caused people to move to suburbs. So that's just a very interesting fact about urban economics. Here's a second example of a research question having to do with real estate economics. So my colleague Lou Han studies real estate markets, and in fact in Toronto in particular. So here's a research question she looked at. There was a recent, I guess not recent any longer, but about 15 years ago, a change in the Toronto real estate market that required an additional down payment if you bought a house worth more than $1 million. Okay, and that down payment was actually a sort of a big jump up. So basically, if you bought a house worth a penny less than $1 million, your down payment was, something of the order of 10%. I mean, it varied by jurisdiction. But the moment it crossed $1 million, it jumped up by more than $100,000. So that created a discontinuity. And so she studied with some colleagues what effect that had. And she shows that this led to a huge bunching of listings, house listings at the 1 million mark. And it led to actually intense bidding wars and probably contributed to house price inflation, even for houses that weren't eventually sold anywhere close to $1 million. So that's an interesting application of microeconomics. And a last example that I'll just mention from my own research, I studied about 10 years ago how Canadian provinces and US states offer incentives to buy clean cars, right? Fuel efficient cars, hybrid cars, or electric cars. And we studied the effect of offering these incentives, basically tax rebates. Did they actually lead to better outcomes, cleaner air, less carbon consumption? We showed that actually offering these incentives led people to indeed buy more of these clean cars, but it didn't actually lead to a significant drop in emissions. And if you're interested in details, then in the paper, I can chat with you about it later on. But basically, people bought these cleaner cars, but they didn't buy them in large enough numbers to justify the cost. It ended up being a huge expense for government, and the resulting carbon emissions drop was basically just a drop in the bucket. It wasn't enough to justify the cost. So that was just a third application that came to mind. So I'm just going to wrap up, and I guess I should mention my own area of industrial economics also studies research questions that are very much in the news, involving large firms, large conglomerates. All the big tech companies are currently facing regulatory scrutiny from governments, from courts, because of their practices. And so that's an area of heavy research in industrial economics that some of my colleagues are involved in. But the last thing I'll say before I stop is just a little bit about academic career paths, especially for those of you who might be interested in continuing your work in economics, going to graduate school, getting a master's degree or a PhD. What are the paths open to you? Well, some of our students have followed a bunch of different paths. One path is to stay in academia, to work in research, to get a PhD and go work at university. It's basically my career path. Teach another generation of students, do your own research. It gives you a lot of freedom. You can spend your time working on academic questions that interest you, like the examples I gave you about urban economics or real estate or environmental economics. That's one path. A different path, something that many economics undergraduates follow, is to go work for the government. And in Canada, there's many such opportunities. The Bank of Canada hires economics students. The Competition Bureau, which regulates firms, hires economists. The Ministry of Finance in Ontario and in every province, including federally, hires economists as well. The nice thing about those jobs is there's direct policy relevance. What you're doing has a direct impact, and that's very satisfying. But you do have less independence to do your own work. You've got to work on what the government decides, what the minister decides, or the premier decides is important. Which is so you have less independence. On the other hand, you have a lot more impact. And finally, a third path that's open to somebody with an advanced degree, with a master's or a PhD, would be to continue and go work in the private sector. So you could work for the banks. So all the big banks hire PhDs or master's students in economics. You could work for a think tank or a research institute, something like the C.D. Howe Institute. There's many such organizations that are very interested in the expertise of economics, undergraduates or people with more advanced degrees. And so these are all interesting, lucrative, and I'd say satisfying options open to students in economics. So that's all I'm going to talk about for now. I'm sure you're keen to hear from our alumni. So thanks everyone. Thanks Derek for doing this, and I'll probably join you in the panel discussion to hear more.
Oh, please. Thank you. Professor Chandra, thank you so much there. Yeah, so we'll get started into our session. I just need you, if you could stop the screen share, that way we can have us all up there.
Yeah, just, there we go.
There we go. Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, please do stick around for the panel as well. So thank you so much for that. So the way the rest of this time is going to work together is I have a set of questions for each of our panelists, and we'll go basically around asking the questions for our panelists. For the students who are attending, we will also have an open Q&A session at the end of our time together once I have finally done the finalized version of our Q&A. So the way as students, you can go ahead and ask questions is you can drop it right there in the chat. We do have a moderator who's going to go through the questions, and then the more popular ones or whatever shows up, we'll ask at the end. So please feel free, students, to ask any questions you wish about the alumni, any of the topics we're talking about, but we'll be saving to go through those at the end of the formal time of our Q&A. So why don't we go ahead and begin? So again, what I'm going to be doing here is just asking a set of questions for each of our alumni, and we'll go through and find out. So question number one is, let's do a bit of a quick introduction. Even though I did a little bit of your background and your bio, can you please, panelists, tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you studied at UTSC, your current role, and a little brief introduction to your employment history. So just a quick introduction. James, you're the closest one to me, so why don't we go ahead and start with you this round? We'll start with you there, James.
Sure. Thanks, Derek, and thanks, Professor, for inviting us, and then also just giving us the opportunity to share. So yeah, a quick introduction. So my name is James. I graduated in 2016 from UTSC's Management and International Business program. And I think for me, I also didn't really know what I wanted to get into when I went into university, like I think many of us are. But I did know that I wanted to focus on something international. So that was kind of my ideal work, with something global and something that focused on different markets and different cultures and stuff like that. Going through university, yeah, it was a co-op program. So I did a couple co-op positions at a pharmaceutical company, and then at a consulting firm overseas as part of the co-op, or as part of the international business program. After that, after graduating, I ended up working for a NGO in West Africa, focused on the NGO focused on widows and orphans in northern Ghana, but my role was a lot of financial specialist, and worked a lot with the internal operations of the organization, and also worked a lot with their social enterprise that they were starting to build up. From there, I ended up coming back to Canada. I was working with the public sector, with the Ontario public government, or Ontario government here in Toronto, and that related to looking at different policies for different ministries, but also looking at their strategic overview, some of their programs, and looking at some of the performance measures that they have to report to, and how it relates to the budget of the provincial budget. Since then, I decided I wanted to develop more into this kind of public sector economics, macroeconomics field, and I decided to do my master's, just because I feel like my UTSC degree was focused a lot on kind of business, and I wanted to kind of complement that with development and development economics. So I ended up doing my master's in international finance and development in London. And it was really, I think like Professor was saying, it was a lot of macroeconomics. So I focused a little bit more on macroeconomics, on different policies that governments go through with the lens on emerging markets and poor and developing countries. So how do these big issues like unemployment, poverty, what kind of markets should be in place for that kind of stuff? That led me to do some research in India with microfinance institutions, and since then I ended up working for a UN agency called UN Capital Development Fund, based in Myanmar. So actually, I'm supposed to be based in Myanmar, but due to the pandemic and other political situations, I've been stuck here in Canada. And my role right now actually focuses a lot on financial inclusion. So working with small scale enterprises, microfinance institutions, working with the government on financial inclusion roadmaps, working with different local banks and different think tanks and development agencies to really have better formal access to financial inclusion or better access to finance. Yeah, and I'll kind of stop right there, and then we can kind of go into anything else later.
No worries. Yeah, we'll come back, James, to find out a lot more what you're doing in detail for your current job in a moment. Thank you. Jeff, I see you next. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself there, please?
Sure. I studied at, I graduated with a specialist in economics and political science. I graduated some time ago. I was going to say not last decade, but the decade before. So I'm probably the senior of the group. But in any event, I remember when I was attending UTSC when it was just one building. Now, obviously, there are several buildings now. So plenty more resources that current students can take advantage of. But overall, it was a positive experience, my time there at UTSC. Just in terms of my employment history, I'll be quite frank. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I graduated. I was all over the map. I was considering a career in law. I was considering a career doing my master's in economics and working for an NGO. Ultimately, I just realized, it wasn't these roles or these avenues didn't necessarily speak to my personality. And ultimately, I just happened to stumble into capital markets. Started off working in data entry and then eventually understanding the space, the environment, and basically taking courses and learning more about that profession, and ultimately finding a role within that respective profession. So in terms of my current role, as Derek had mentioned, I work as a director of originations at Cortland Credit Group, which is an asset management firm. We basically focus on fixed income investing as well as alternative finance. So my role is heavily weighted towards the latter component of our business. And really what it entails is just basically looking at a number of investment opportunities and how we can finance these opportunities to help with their growth.
Thank you, Jeff. Vivican, your turn, please.
Cool, thank you all. Actually, James and I started school and left around the same time. So we've had similar but different journeys in many senses. Actually, while we're there, Professor Chandra, I was looking at your profile because we didn't recognize you, and I think you were on leave during most of the time that we were in school, so we didn't get the chance to study under you, but it seems like you have a lot of really interesting research interests. But I think, so going back to kind of this journey at UTSC, I think, I kind of jumped around as well. I started off in a past life working in audit, and then started going the CPG route, so working with the consumer packaged goods company. But I think in the back of my mind, things around inequality and economic development had always been kind of deep-rooted, but never really had a academic or professional understanding of all of it. And over time, kind of just with different types of exposures, saw inequality from different lenses, and kind of sitting at it from the perspective of human development, but also from an economic standpoint, and how understanding how markets work, or rather don't work in the favor of certain groups of people and certain populations. So after I kind of finished at university, I was working with a few different NGOs over the years. Started off in East Africa, in Malawi, and then slowly kind of spent some time in Asia as well, in Laos, and also where I'm from, Sri Lanka. So with those NGOs, kind of just learning about development, learning about business in emerging markets, understanding the different constraints that economies face, both at a macro level, but also at a micro level across several different sectors. But now I've kind of landed a really small consulting firm that also does a lot of research as well as implementation, looking at kind of inclusive markets, right? Thinking about what are these market efficiencies and market inefficiencies. A lot of what Professor Chandra said about incentives, kind of aligning incentives of these different players within an economy to kind of facilitate systems changes that ideally would kind of put certain groups, certain sectors on a path towards a more inclusive system. And that both at a very micro level, at a business level, but also at a macro level, more so around policy. So I'll get into kind of everyday work later, but I think a lot of the interest for me right now is around agriculture. It's always been an interest, but again, now it's actually kind of coming together in a professional sense and kind of understanding how all these different pieces come together. And of course, a lot of things, a lot of themes have emerged over the past few years around economic development. And so I think that keeps us all on our toes, but that's kind of where I sit right now. Most of our work is around the world, in the US, in different countries, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. So it really depends, but right now we're doing work across several different sectors, primarily focused on inclusive market development.
Thank you very much. And Professor Chandra, can you share a little bit about your journey and story?
Sure. I think one theme here is emerging is many of us didn't know what we wanted to do after finishing our undergraduate degrees. That was true of me as well. I had an undergraduate degree in math, and I stumbled into graduate school in economics. Really, I didn't know what I was getting into. It turned out to have worked out fairly well, but it could have gone quite badly. But no, so I got my PhD in economics in the United States at Northwestern University. I went in thinking I wanted to do macroeconomics. I came out doing something completely different, which is industrial economics. So I study, from an academic point of view, how firms compete with each other in different industries. A couple of examples would be automobiles and airlines. Right now, the last few years, I've been looking at airlines in particular. So the airline industry in Canada, in the United States, what drives competition, what causes prices to be the way they are, what causes prices to rise in advance of travel, what causes, how does competition change prices, how do mergers affect prices and outcomes. It's fascinating because, airlines are a big industry, they matter a lot, but they're also in the news all the time. Just right now, there's all this talk about airline bailouts in Canada. Should the government, bail them out because they obviously had taken a big hit in the last year, or not? There's obviously, as with anything, there's trade-offs. If they do, there'll be some good that comes out of it, then there'll be some bad that comes out of it. And so the government needs to weigh those. Another example with airlines right now is mergers. So Air Canada is trying to take over Air Transat. In fact, that deal has been on the table for more than a year. It got put off because of the pandemic. It's back on right now. One of the things I've argued is that Air Canada should not be allowed to take over Transat. It will lead to worse outcomes for consumers, higher prices, less competition. But just being able to study these questions using real world data, being able to come up with policy recommendations, I find very interesting. And I think it's motivating because somewhere along the line, hopefully this research has some impact. Someone somewhere will read it. Hopefully, some policymaker, some government official, and so that's rewarding. One thing I just wanted to add, because I was listening to Vivek's sort of his own sort of history. And I completely forgot when I was making my slide deck to talk about development economics, which is crazy because it's actually a really important part of microeconomics. And of course, it's the area you work in. And development economics is one of the great successes of economics in the last couple of decades. Some of the most important things and most, persuasive things we've learned is in the field of development economics. Economists have learned how certain kinds of interventions with respect to public health or just financial interventions can radically change outcomes in developing economies, in villages, in rural areas. And so, yeah, that totally slipped my mind to put in my slide deck. But I'm you know, so it's great to sort of hear your experience in your own field with that.
Well, thank you very much. Now we're going to find out a little bit more about your actual position you're doing. So can you please describe a little bit more detail what you're currently doing in your current role? Jeff, let's start with you.
Great, thanks, Derek. So basically, I mean, I analyze companies day to day. You know, a number of companies will approach us from a capital standpoint, and at the same time, too, we have to look at the performance of our portfolio. So, you know, part of my day to day really involves looking at a number of companies, looking at their financials, looking at various news releases. And even when I'm introduced to a company, I'll spend the time to talk with management to get a better understanding of their business. You know, why is it that they need capital? And, you know, essentially, you know, what's going to be their growth strategy over the next few years. And for us as capital providers, I need to better understand, you know, how we're not going to be negatively impacted in the event of, say, global events like a pandemic, or, you know, even within an industry where there could be increased competition that could potentially squeeze out some participants in that particular sector. So that's basically the work that I do. It's primarily the analysis of various sectors and companies from an operational level as well as financial level. So that's basically it in a nutshell. I think there was like an additional question in terms of benefits and challenges. I think the one beauty of the role that I'm in is getting to see where our world is heading, right? I mean, today you hear about themes as big data, you know, blockchain. These are things that I was looking at more than a decade ago when venture companies, venture capitalist firms were investing in this space when it was fairly unknown to a lot of the mainstream. But now, you know, it's part of our regular jargon. You know, in fact, Professor Chandra mentioned that that one of the key roles as economists or students of economics is the understanding of data, and that's basically our world today as we advance towards digital transformation, or as digital transformation accelerates. And you know, I've seen in a number of presentations that, you know, gold used to carry a certain value. These days, data is the new gold. So, you know, in terms of correlating my work experience with economics, it's basically understanding the way our world is moving forward. So that's one of the benefits. I mean, there are certain challenges that are associated with the role that is dealt more with competition, industry competition. But, you know, to me, I think from what I've just conveyed with the benefits, it certainly outweighs the challenges. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Jeff. Vivikan, can you tell us about your job a little bit more?
Sure, and I think just a primer, what you'll probably, to the audience, what you'll probably realize is just between the four of us, like I think we do very different things, but you're going to see some overlap, not just in the kind of skills that you need in these different areas, but also just overlapping themes of how different players in just the world kind of interact with one another. Because there's a lot of work being done in development economics with banks, with capital providers, right? And in my day-to-day even, I'm oftentimes looking at research publications like people like Professor Chandra have probably put out there on different areas of interest, because you're not always kind of regurgitating or running research studies all the time. Sometimes it's more valuable to kind of draw from existing research, draw from existing publications. So you'll see a lot of kind of a thread that kind of connects all these different pieces. But so in my day-to-day, so now a lot of my work is, so as a consultant, you're kind of placed on several different programs, several different engagements. And so right now I'm kind of placed on two long-term engagements, one of which is in Rwanda, the other in Mozambique. And it's primarily looking at livestock as well as agricultural sectors. I'm looking at how do you improve several different areas, but I think with the end goal of creating more inclusive market system. And so a day I think looks very different. One day, you know, I think 90% of my time is on technical work, doing analysis, developing strategy, working with the team to, you know, co-create solutions. that are focused on facilitating these types of changes in the economies and markets that we work in. But on the other side, there's also a lot of work being done around evaluations, evaluating the economic impact, social impact of these different activities. Sometimes these can be at a very small scale. So right now, most of my afternoon, I was working on my analysis around some of the interventions that we have that we introduce in the cotton industries, or rather not we, but our partners have introduced. Larger cotton buyers, equivalent would be, in the chocolate industry, you might think about your Nestle, for example, or a Unilever. But in the cotton industry, looking at some of the activities that they've introduced to create more inclusive benefits for the farmers, kind of just running evaluation analysis on what kind of changes are we seeing, what kind of systemic changes are we seeing, and then where do we want to take it from there. One day might be, tomorrow morning, I'm going to be working with some of my colleagues in Rwanda, just brainstorming one of the innovations that we've been thinking about as it relates to poultry processing, right? So processing of chicken in Rwanda. So it really varies. And I've noticed that, so I haven't gotten too much experience on conducting actual research studies, but a lot of my colleagues do actually spend a decent amount of their time actually conducting different kinds of studies of different scales. Oftentimes they're a little bit smaller in scale and very much focused towards a country that we're working or a specific challenge or issue that we're working in, and it's very much geared towards with an implementation focus. And so you want to be able to action it. But there are times that there's publications that come out that are a little bit more vast, a little bit more far-reaching, that are often used across the sector. So long story short, some days it's analysis work, some days it's thinking about implementation and kind of brainstorming different solutions. But it really depends on the sectors that you work in. But before this, a lot of my work was on the implementation side, because I was in country and I was able to work with folks in country, kind of actually running these programs, working with different market actors like banks, like entrepreneurs, like the government. So it really does vary. And I think that also, benefits and challenges, it's a really nice way to get a lot of breadth of experiences as well as depth. But I think that's also a double-edged sword, especially as I'm kind of still relatively early on in this industry. But it does kind of present a challenge when one day you're kind of thinking about livestock, the next day you're thinking about the cotton industry. It's really exciting because there's obviously a lot of learnings you can bring from either or, especially when it concerns fundamental economics. But it is challenging to kind of, constantly shift gears into different sectors. And I think that's something it's a nature of working in a consulting group, as opposed to kind of working in one particular program. But I think that really just kind of summarizes what my day looks like, or could look like.
Thank you, Vivekan. Professor Chandra, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do? Even though it might seem obvious, I'm sure there's some inside details that would be very interesting.
Yeah, it might seem obvious if you would ask, what does a university professor do? What's a typical day look like? To a lot of people, you might think, well, you're a teacher, right? But teaching is just half of my job, and it's a very important and very rewarding part of my job. But the other half is research. And so what's actually very striking is teaching and research are actually very different. So on a teaching day, as I'm sure any student would know, a professor is in the classroom, or maybe conducting office hours, or maybe preparing for class, or preparing a slide deck, or grading. Some of this involves being in front of a big group of people and lecturing. Some of it involves, sitting in the office by yourself and grading papers or writing up an exam or something like that. But that's the teaching side. But really the other 50% of the time, maybe more than 50%, is research, which is very different. The research is something that, students don't necessarily see us in our research unless you maybe do an RA opportunity or something like that. But research is very different. Research can be very solitary. Not necessarily. You could have a collaborator and or a team, but in economics, unlike in the sciences, you don't tend to have labs. You work on your own in your office, maybe with a co-author on the phone or on Skype or something like that. But most of the time, you're just doing kind of what Jeff alluded to. You're working with data. At least if you're an empirical economist, like I am, you're using data to answer research questions. And so what my typical research day would look like, which is very different from the teaching day when I'm standing in front of in a classroom. On a research day, I'd be on my computer using Stata or R. Increasingly we use R. It's an open source programming software. Increasingly we're getting students at UTSC to learn how to use R. We think it's a vital skill. I'm sure all of our other alumni on the panel would agree. the ability to work with data is critical. And so that's what I use. I use R or Stata sometimes to analyze large data sets, to use the data to test a hypothesis, or maybe use the data to tell a story of what we think is going on in a certain industry, since I'm an industrial economist, or trade between countries if you're a trade economist. And that often involves writing code, right? Writing programs to generate a graph or a table, or to run a regression, to test a hypothesis. So a lot of it, it's actually quite striking. On a Monday morning, I could be lecturing in front of a classroom of 100 students. On a Tuesday morning, I could be all by myself in my office or in a cafe working on some obscure lines of code. So it's very different. Those days look very different. But it's important to remember that if you were to pursue the academic path, these two halves of your life would be there. Now, that's, I am a research professor, many of my colleagues are, but of course, many of my colleagues aren't. Some of them are teaching professors. So then their job is entirely teaching. They don't do research necessarily, or at least not primarily. And so then, of course, they'll be doing a lot more of, in the classroom or office hours, or writing assignments or grading assignments. And that's the kind of thing that I'm sure, all of the students are sort of familiar with, because you see that happen in real time. You see how that process plays out. But the research side is something that, you probably tend not to see. So it's interesting how it feels very different from the sort of more, energetic, hands-on, interaction, which is what happens when you're on the teaching side.
Thank you, Professor. James, tell us about your day.
Well, today was not bad. No, but in general, I think it's a really tough question. And I think just because, similar to everyone else, it changes from day to day. And I think more like Vivekan, it's really based on the projects. And, sometimes you're working on a completely different project depending on a donor. And because everything is project-based, it's not just the implementation side, but it's the project management side and relationship building with the donor. You're doing a lot of donor reporting. Like, for example, this past month and a half is just a bunch of donor reporting for us, because we had, core Q4 reporting and annual reporting and semi-annual reporting, and it's so many different levels. So so there is that aspect of it. For me, the more fun and exciting part is the implementation, and that relates to, I'm working on two major projects right now. One is focused on market development. So that's working a lot with microfinance institutions in Myanmar, and we do a lot of one aspect of it is doing a lot of capacity building for them. So they've been moving from an NGO corporate culture and NGO kind of structure to a company structure. So it's a lot of training them on business operations, delinquency management, how to run branches, leadership skills, establishing a board of directors, abiding by the company law and everything like that. But then the other aspect of it is also working with or doing lending facilities. So similar to Jeff, it's finding what are the best investments that we as an institution can lend to, especially the microfinance institutions and the small SMEs, small medium enterprises. So it's been doing a lot of due diligence, reviewing their financial statements, their business plans, and then putting together a case and going to an investment committee and really, from our side, lending the money and then monitoring that lending. The other project that I'm also working on is also related to women-led and women-owned enterprises. They're doing a lot of research about how these businesses have been really affected, not just because of COVID, but also just the systemic gender gaps that exist in countries, especially like Myanmar, where there's a lot of social divide that causes these gender gaps. And primarily that's because a lot of women also just don't have as much access to financial inclusion or financial services as men do. So we found that they've been extremely hit with COVID. So that's something we're working on to build together an accelerator program to help kind of build resilient enterprises, but also gender transformative enterprises. So trying to work with the government to have engendered policies and and results frameworks as part of their normal decision making, but also as part of the businesses to think about their whole value chain. How can they include gender and be more inclusive in that? And then the other aspect is, increasing access to finance, so finding potential impact investors, local banks to build that linkage. So yeah, and actually my role kind of shifts from day to day because I also do a lot of internal operations with my organization, just building internal like organizational structure within ourselves, and it's been really challenging and rewarding. I think obviously rewarding because you're really working with a lot of vulnerable societies. Similar to what Vivican said, you're trying to see what works in the market, what doesn't work. You're really making an impact in these small rural communities, especially when you're in the field. But it's challenging because every day is very difficult. For example, for us in Myanmar, the past week or since February, there's been a massive military coup, which has really put an effect on all our programs now. So we can't really work with the government. There's a lot of protests going on. It's very unsafe. All the local banks or all the private banks in Myanmar are kind of shut down. So, banks used to be one of our biggest stakeholders and partners, and now it's hard to work with them, and it impacts a lot of the rural communities that we used to work with. So there are those challenges when you're working in these kind of developing countries with regards to political risk, economic risk. It's a huge thing now. We don't know what will happen with inflation when we talk about macroeconomics. We don't know what will happen with international investment, and we work with a lot of impact investors and international investors, and we don't know whether they're going to pull their investments and stuff like that. So there's a lot of uncertainty. You do it day by day. Right now, that's another thing I'm working on, is just kind of doing like a program review and criticality assessment of all our programs, see how they're impacted, how can we manipulate it, how do we deal with donors that say don't work with the government, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's fun.
I'm glad it's fun. Now, one theme I've heard actually a lot from our panelists tonight is this whole, I don't know what I want to do when I graduate. So the next question I have is, how did you become interested in this industry? How did you make the decision to pursue this as a career, I guess, eventually, right? So Vivican, let's start with you on that question.
Sure. I alluded to it earlier and kind of diving into it a bit more. I think just growing up, there was just exposure around things around inequality, which can be very widely defined. But it was very much so, reading, watching things, talking about it as a kid, as an adolescent, and then I guess as a young adult. But I think it was, being in business school kind of gives you certain skills. And I think because I had a general specialist, I didn't specialize. I think it kind of gives you exposure in different areas. And then you start thinking, hey, you know what? A lot of these things, I wonder how it's looked at from the perspective, or I wonder how inequality is looked at from this perspective. And I think for a long time, I always thought, maybe I'll find a way to build a career in the nonprofit world where you're thinking about social impact and addressing inequality, but never really knew what that looked like per se. But conversations with people like James and others at the university and others outside the university kind of helped put that in perspective. But I think for me, it was realizing that, one, there was a moral obligation, but I think even more powerful than that was just intellectual curiosity, which is what I kind of came across as I was going through university was, hey, it's not just that I feel badly about the inequality around me. It was more so, it's also really interesting to think about how these things have come about, right? What has led to this? What can lead us out of it? Then there's so many different lenses to look at it from, right? You can look at it from a human development perspective and anthropology, sociology, economics. There's so many different perspectives, and I think that really, really appealed to me. And like Professor Chandra said, right, economics is a social science as well. And while there's a big push for empirical form of economics, it's interesting when you're able to actually kind of quantify a lot of these different implications of inequality, the things that have led to it and the things that might lead you out. And the most challenging thing, and I think James is also kind of alluding to it, is there's so many different factors that affect it that you're never really going to solve any of this overnight. And I think that's, as much as it frustrates you, it's also kind of, it intrigues you in many ways, or at least intrigued me, to say, I want to spend time thinking about these things. I want to spend time around folks who are thinking about it and who are approaching it through different areas. And I think over the past few years, what I've realized is while I've always had an opinion about different areas of development, different areas of economics, it evolves over time as you're exposed to more things. And I think how I got to where I am today, I think it was just, realizing that the private sector is a very important function in all of this. Economics is a really important function in all this. It's an area that I'd like to spend a bit more time in. So it was starting off with that interest around inequality and then letting it kind of grow through different types of exposures and different influences over the years. That's led me now to say, you know what, economic perspective, private sector perspective, and how do we kind of work from market development perspective, right? And lucky for me, there's already been several, philosophers, several intellectuals, academics, practitioners who've kind of developed a lot of evidence base for these different approaches and ideas. And I think it's just exciting to be a part of the process of not just applying these, proven approaches, but also kind of developing further evidence base to understand, hey, do these things really work? Or is it all kind of, just theoretical, or what can we do to make it better, et cetera, et cetera. I think, so it's kind of shaped up that way, and that's, kind of where I am today.
Thank you, Vivekanth. Professor Chandra, what led you to this?
Well, as I mentioned briefly, I sort of stumbled into being an academic, being a professor. I finished my undergraduate degree in mathematics, which I liked, but it was too dry for my taste. And so I was looking for something more applied. I was thinking of operations research. I was thinking of finance, and somehow I guess I applied to a few graduate programs in economics, and I got into one. And it was luck. It was serendipity. I mean, it was. And I was just reflecting back when I was listening to some of the other answers. I was an undergraduate, I guess, a long time ago now. I finished in 1999, so that's 22 years ago. I can't even believe that. And back then, I feel like my experience and that of my peers was you just sort of stumbled into things and you didn't really know what you were doing. And a lot of people, unfortunately, ended up in professions they didn't like. And I guess I got lucky. I ended up in a profession I did. But I have to say, it's very different today. And I think that's hopefully should be quite encouraging to all students today, because back then you didn't know what different careers or professions involve. You could ask people, but that's the best you could hope for. Whereas now, if you're interested in being, say, an academic economist, or working in capital markets, or working in the development sector, there's so many more resources. You can just go online and look up, or even contact people who work in these fields. You can go to, Reddit and read about, what it means to be, or, read about and ask me anything that, people might do on Reddit to see what, a capital markets trader might do, or what a professor might do, or what a chef might do. I mean, these are things that suddenly I think these students today have a wealth of resources to try to figure out what they want to do and what they might be good at, in a way that I feel like my generation never did. And so hopefully that is leading to and will continue to lead to better matches between students' individual interests and their professions and career choices. At least I think that's my hope. But yeah, no, I sort of stumbled into this by accident. Even when I went to graduate school, I never thought I'd end up being a professor. I thought I'd get a PhD and maybe go work in a bank, or go work in a private sector organization, make a lot of money. And it's only after being in academia for a while that I realized there's actually, the freedom to work in whatever you want, to answer any question you want is actually huge. That's a kind of freedom that, very few people have that sort of luxury. So it became clear to me that's what I want to do. But yeah, I think that there's, the fact that, we're organizing this event right now, trying to get students to understand different career paths, different options open to them. And there's so many other such resources that U of T and UTSC, but even more broadly, society makes available now, I think is great. I think it hopefully will lead to students having a greater awareness of their options and their, the different roads open to them than, back in my time.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor. James, tell us about your interest into this field. What got you into it?
Sure. I'll try to keep it quick because I think it's kind of been said. So maybe echo a few things. For me, actually, yeah. Again, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but for some reason, I was always drawn to economics from high school onwards, and that sounds really strange. And a lot of my friends didn't understand it. Even in university, they thought I was a loser. But there was something about it that I just really enjoyed, and I was like, hey, these concepts make sense to me, and it may not make sense to everyone else, but it was really intriguing to see how markets worked and how when we talk about macroeconomics, how different government policies can really affect these markets, and a lot of behaviors with the participants in the market and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I was like, I don't really know what career is really going to come out of this, my interest in economics. So I followed a typical kind of business route, but I did start to take different courses in economics and different courses in development, because I was like, this is kind of a, like, you know, Professor Chandra said, these development economics was really changing. It's really changing. It's really interesting. And not a lot of people, especially in business, think about it. It ends up being a lot of, you know, development studies students, and other types of social sciences, humanities types of students. So that was what interested me. Again, but throughout university, I thought I was going to end up in a corporate lifestyle, corporate organization. And I would have been okay with that, I think, or I was okay with that going through university, but I always kind of had this longing for working in developing markets. I also just felt like it's really interesting. It's really dynamic. So towards the end of my university career, third year, fourth year, I started to take a lot more development economics courses, a lot more macroeconomics courses that really sparked my interest. And then, you know, at one point after I graduated, you know, I was still trying to find a job, but it sounds kind of cliche, but I really had a fork in the road. I could have either taken a corporate job that was offered to me, or take a huge risk and go into the development sector, short term, not a lot of money, and see where it leads me. And I thought, you know what, I'm super young in my career. If I need to figure out what this passion or what this longing is, so this is the only way to do it. It was low risk, high reward, and that's kind of how it ended up being that way.
All right, thank you, James. And Jeff, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think my story is no different than what's been conveyed already. But you know, I think when I went to high school, there weren't really that many courses that were offered, and so economics was one of the course that really spoke to me, and so obviously that was pursued in undergrad. You know, it's interesting just hearing some of the other panelists. You know, I'm kind of the reverse. I was actually looking at roles, NGO type roles, community type roles. You know, I was working for different other research organizations to sort of dive into that space. And you know, I guess for me, it was just more or less aligning my career path with my personality and interests. Somebody had introduced a book to me, What Color is Your Parachute? And ultimately I determined that, you know, I wanted to embark on a career that really identified with those interests and my personality. And subsequently, you know, I think it's worked really well and allowed me to succeed, right? But, you know, nothing's definitive. I'm sure that at some point I may look at other roles that will sort of pursue some of those early ambitions that I had when I was young and graduating from undergrad there at UTSC.
Well, speaking about being young and graduated from UTSC, that's to do with our next question. We got to think way back on this one. Let's think about your first job, the one you got after graduation, right? Hopefully within the industry. What was your first job after graduation, and how did you get it? How did you apply to it? Was it through like networking online, something you found on the internet? Tell us about your first job there. So, Professor, let's start off with you there. Do you remember what your first job was all the way back then?
I mean, some people would say I've never really had a real job, because I finished undergraduate, went straight to grad school, went straight to being a professor. And so maybe just being a professor was my first real job. But my first job, if that's how you put it, would be I finished graduate school and went to work at UBC, the University of British Columbia, as an assistant professor there back in 2006. You know, it happened because, you know, there was a well-defined job market for economics PhDs. There was institutions that were hiring the PhD students who are looking for jobs. There's a sort of a centralized job market where basically you get interviewed and different institutions make you offers. And so, you know, UBC made me an offer. I went there. I loved the place. I still, you know, miss living in BC, miss living in Vancouver. But, you know, Toronto is just very different, and, you know, I'm in many ways much happier here. But yeah, that was my first job. That was actually the first time So I guess I was older than anybody else on the panel when I got my first job, since I went straight to grad school, but I must have been my late 20s. Yeah, that was a very strange experience, going from being a poor grad student to suddenly a professor. Not that I was, not that that's very financially rewarding, but yeah, I guess that was my experience.
Thank you, Professor. James, tell us about your first job after graduation.
Sorry, is this after graduation or just in general?
After graduation, like
after
that
graduation.
First job, how did you get that? What
Okay.
was it?
Yeah, my first job after graduation was working for an NGO in northern Ghana. Again, this was during my whole career exploration path, and just started looking for different. I thought anything that would get me into the field would be useful. So started looking at internships, short-term contracts, and I just kind of came across. I don't know how, but I just through Google searches came across a global affairs funded program that worked with the Canadian organization. My Canadian organization was based out of Nova Scotia, who then would partner you up with an NGO or some sort of organization in a developing country. They had specific roles, so it was catered to people who had previous experience and a degree. And yeah, I was like, you know what? I'm pretty sure I applied after the deadline, because I was like, I'm just going to shoot my shot and see what happens. And yeah, it ended up working out well for me. So it was like a 7-8 month contract. And yeah, it was, again, like Professor Chandra said, it wasn't like a lot of money or anything. I just thought this was a good opportunity for me to get my foot in the door, and really good experience, especially in the field. So.
All right. Thank you, James. Jeff, how about yourself?
My first job out of university was working for the Ministry of Attorney General. It was largely in a clerical role. In fact, and the job itself was introduced to me by a fellow alum. He was a couple of years older, and he had a life sciences background, and he was working in the finance department. I ran into him in the meeting place, and he basically said that he had some openings. So I connected with him, and he got me a job. Initially I wanted to better understand the legal environment and potentially look at a career in law, but ultimately that's not where I ended up. But in any event, that was my first employment experience after university.
Good thing about that networking contact and that meeting, huh? You never know.
Absolutely.
You never know where conversation is going to take you. That's for sure. Vivikan, tell us about your first job there, please.
You got me excited with the first job. I was going to say I was working at a athletics retail store, but first job out of graduation, not nearly as interesting. But no, I'm kidding. It was very similar to what James had said, actually, and similar pathways too. In fact, I think James had actually introduced me to certain resources, because he was, he had at that point when I was applying, he had already kind of secured that opportunity to work in Ghana. But I think for me, it was what also kind of set that in motion. I was working in East Africa, in Malawi, with a Canadian organization, Global Affairs Canada funded, and I was partnered up with the Small Medium Enterprise Development Institute of Malawi, which is an institute that provided all kinds of advisory as well as advocacy services for small, medium businesses, because those kinds of businesses are ultimately the engine for a lot of economies, even in Canada, you can argue. And so a lot of that work was very business development, business management focused. So thinking about finance, thinking about marketing, thinking about accounting from the perspective of small, medium businesses. So it kind of goes back to Professor Chandra's points about how economics kind of really influences your thinking in all these different areas. And so that was my first gig, also about 6-month contract, and things left from there. But what kind of set that in motion was actually, one, James, of course, those conversations, and also two, just speaking to our co-op coordinators in my final co-op, just letting them know that I'm kind of interested. And they kind of said, go speak to this person within the International Development Studies program at UTSC. She kind of gave me a whole long list of different organizations to look at. And what I didn't realize then was some of the professors that we have, or at least had at that point in management, although they weren't focused on development and development economics, they had a lot of contacts who had done work in these spaces. And so one of our strategy professors had introduced me to her old friend who was doing research on development economics in Malawi. And at that time, I wasn't so attuned to what development economics really looked like in practice. But I think, one thing leads to another. And of course, you have these conversations with different people and you realize the different perspectives that you can look at what you might think is your passion. And then one thing leads to the other from there.
Thank you very much. So we did see some commonalities with all your stories. One was contracts are a good thing because, it's short term, but it got you into the field. Conversations are an excellent tool with individuals because you never know who knows whom and how it can get you started. And take a chance. I'm hearing that quite a lot as well for all of you. So, students that are listening, those are very important things to think about, that contracts are a good thing because it can get you into the door, we heard quite a bit. Have lots of great conversations with individuals, either, senior students, coordinators, individuals within the school itself, your professors. You never know where these things are going to take you. Let's look at our next question. You're talking about academics. So how did your academics experience prepare you for these opportunities that you're getting into? So you can think about your classes you took, courses, projects, but I also want you to think outside of the standard academic as well. So did you participate in any club activity, for example? I know management has a lot of clubs out there. So were you part of any clubs? How did that help prepare you? So let's look at both in the class, out of the class within UTSC. How did it help you with where you are right now? And James, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. I think I alluded to this a little bit before, so I'll kind of repeat myself and keep it short as well. But academic experiences, I mean, in terms of, I know you said beyond UTSC courses, but actually UTSC courses helped me a lot. But more specifically, it was UTSC courses that weren't business courses. I started taking courses on the other side of campus, which I guess is the humanities side. I think Jeff doesn't know that because he only had one building back then, but yeah, so it was a lot of humanities courses, social sciences courses, and development studies courses. And I thought, hey, back then the MIB program was really new and kind of flexible. So I had a little bit of flexibility in the courses I wanted to choose. And the department was pretty cool with that. So started taking courses that piqued my interest in terms of political economy of development and intro to development studies, and a lot of economics courses. Aside from that, I still felt like, Vivican was saying that you don't talk a lot about development in business. So I started to have conversations like Vivican said, but also start to read a lot of different books that interested me on sustainable development, just economics, development economics, like, economics for the poor and all these kinds of different things. So that definitely helped. I think there's a lot of value in working in clubs and being part of clubs. I think that will come up a lot. Everyone knows that there's a lot of transferable skills, just leadership and working with different personalities and all that kind of stuff. But from a pure kind of interest in my field, it really came from finding different resources, kind of stepping outside the comfort zone of what you're used to as a business student or economic student.
Thank you, James. How about yourself, Jeff?
Well, I'll just quickly say that one of the benefits of being inside when having only one building is the fact that, for these cold winter months, you don't have to go outside for to attend your other classes. So, but that being said, obviously I think U of T has a global reputation. The standards are quite high. Clearly the coursework is very challenging, and I think that really instills a certain level of work ethic and an ability to do research and to think. Right. And, that carries beyond the classroom. Right. One of the things that is important in my day to day is idea sharing. It's quite common practice. And I think that, for other organizations, I don't want to necessarily say it's limited to capital markets, but, there's always ideas in terms of improvement. So, I think that's probably one of the benefits with some of the courses that I took. Similar to James, he took some humanities courses. I had a specialist that combined economics and political science. So, certainly a lot of that level of research for both programs helped to build the mindset that I kind of have today. In terms of clubs and teams, I'll be quite honest. I wasn't really too involved my first couple of years, I'll be frank. After my first year, I actually dropped out for for 2 years and then came back and basically completed 3 years in 2 years. So when I came back to school, you know, I had that focus and I basically was pretty much tied into my coursework. That being said, I was still involved with a few intramural activities and as well as a few other social clubs. And, you know, I think that helped for me to build those relationships because, you know, to this day, in whether it be in my current field or even outside my field, I'll sometimes connect with some of those schoolmates or friends, and you know, we'll either discuss certain ideas or we'll just discuss life in general, right? But and especially right now, given the pandemic, when most people are being isolated, it's good to have those type of relationships just for, you know, general mental health.
Right. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. Vivican, how about yourself?
So I think with school involvement, I think a lot of the involvement with clubs kind of helped, at least for me, hone up a lot of soft skills, which now I wouldn't say I'm perfect at by any means. Obviously, there's always things that you can improve on, but I feel like that's also allowed me to kind of focus on different skill areas now that I'm kind of working within my career, as opposed to having to, you know, spreading yourself thin and trying to focus on so many different skill areas. Now I feel like I can really drill down on technical pieces, whereas other things might come a little bit easier. And I think a lot of that goes back to some of the involvement and learning, just being student leaders on campus and just, you know, dealing with and working with different groups of people. As far as coursework, again, similar to James, but and like Jeff said, unfortunately, was walking alone to the other side of campus because we weren't taking some of these courses at the same time because it doesn't always sync up. But a lot of business kids don't take those courses. So it was always a lot of lonely walks in the cold. But I think that also kind of just helps round out your perspective. But I wouldn't rely solely on your university. I think for sure, like Akash was saying, you know, talking about books, there's a lot of books out there. There's a lot of articles out there, a lot of podcasts now, especially for you to learn about different things. So I highly, highly encourage those things because I think learning and consumption of knowledge comes from so many different sources. But you start well kind of looking at the econ program within UTSC.
Thank you so much. How about yourself there, Professor?
Well, I was never a student at UTSC, so I can't give you any perspective from that. But let me just tell you, as my perspective now as a professor, I happen to actually be on a committee right now to modify and revamp the core curriculum at UTSC management, you know, the set of courses that all our students have to take. Because one criticism we've gotten from students and alumni and, you know, other stakeholders is that the core is too big. There's too many courses the students are required to take, and so there's not enough freedom for them to take other courses. Kind of like what James was talking about, the freedom that he had to walk over to humanities and take a couple of humanities courses, which probably, you know, piqued his interest and led to, you know, him making interesting career choices. We'd like our students to have more freedom. And so with any luck, if our committee comes to agreement, we can slim down the core a little bit, give students a little bit more flexibility to take, you know, either other electives in management or go take more humanities courses to try to get a slightly broader outlook during your time at UTSC. And one other thing I'll just say is on the sort of clubs and groups point, as Jeff said, I mean, I think it's super important. Obviously, academics is crucial, and I mean that doing well in academics is important. But you know, you're at university during a unique time of your life. You'll never be in your early 20s again. You'll be working in an organization with bosses and colleagues, and you'll never be again at a stage of life where you've got a large group of peers, people your age, with whom you can build strong relationships and have good friendships that'll hopefully last you forever. And so I think that's really important. The more you can do that, I think you'll never regret that. So even though I wasn't UTSC myself, but I see that in our students, and I think that's one of our strengths. So I think that's something that I would very much encourage our students to do.
All right, thank you so much there. This next question I'm going to do a bit different. I'm not going to go around the circle of panelists for it, because I feel we'll get many of the same responses here. So this next one, I would like to do more of a popcorn. So you don't have to answer this one if you don't want, but I feel that many of you will say the same thing. What are the biggest trends you see right now in economics? Where do you see this industry going in the next, let's say, 5 years or so? So I'll kind of do this one popcorn. So go ahead and speak if you'd like to share about it. Where do you see the current trends being?
Well, Derek, I can't really talk too much about like the state of economics, but I will say that within capital markets, we talked about data, and with data that's associated with technology, there is digital transformation. There is disruption. I'm not going to lie about that. I'm going to be quite candid. I don't know if in a few years from now, my role is replaced by AI, right? It's a good possibility. I can tell you right now, I know one organization, which is a government organization, which has been providing a number of loans to businesses. So I'm sure a few of you could probably gather which organization that is, but they're already implementing that on a certain level, right? So, I think, with these words of caution, I would say that, there is still obviously going to be a role if capital markets is going to be an avenue that you pursue. I think it's just important to really strategize. And I really applaud all the attendees today that are participating on this conversation, because to be quite frank, I mean, I wasn't necessarily as motivated when I was your age, and to understand, what could be, what the world might eventually look like when I graduate, right? So, hopefully that's one of the takeaways that the attendees will be able to take from this discussion, is how to best position them for tomorrow's world, right?
Very good, thank you. Anybody else? What do you see as big trends happening in your field in the next few years?
I think it'll be important to look at economics from a very holistic perspective. I'm just going to throw a bunch of keywords out here because we can't get into it, but just circular economics, green economics. I think look into those things that might be of interest to you, because that's just another dimension of sustainability that cross cuts, and I think in all the different areas within economics. And that's going to be, I mean, it already is and it has been for a long time, but I think as you're kind of phasing out of university, really think about that and having those conversations, and maybe just reading about it. You might not specialize in that space, but it would be good to know what's kind of being done around that. And I think that's definitely a growing trend.
Excellent. Any other trends anybody wants to talk about?
Yeah, let me just add on to that. Actually, I agree with Jeff and Vivek. And Jeff, actually, I agree with you. One, because I think digital transformation happens at different levels in different countries, and you're right. There's so much digital transformation happening in developed world, but there's also so much digital transformation happening in developing countries. And you're talking about digital finance, and that's a huge thing for us. But it's different levels. It's how do we even get them plugged in to use an online app for banking systems and creating that interoperability. To add on to Vivekan's point, also, yeah, so many different things, even like feminist economics, social economics, thinking about not just kind of the markets, but also just the broader social impact. One thing I would add is, especially in development, is a lot of blended finance, and this is just a new kind of innovative finance way of allowing. It's not so much traditional aid, it's more like donor funds that are actually being used in private sector and kind of mobilizing that, so it's used in a different way, and it really starts to affect or starts to impact the social development goals or sustainable development goals.
Thank you. Just aware of time, we just got about 5 minutes left, so I want to get these last couple key points, and so we'll do our last two questions as popcorn, then we'll see if there's any questions that pop up in the Q&A there. Professional designations. I understand that both James and obviously Professor Chandra both have professional designations, got their master's and obviously PhD. How much would a professional designation be advised for students to consider going into your fields?
I think in capital markets, it's certainly important. It is a different language, right? So certainly designations like the CFA or even pursuing an MBA certainly helps. Capital markets basically touches on, I guess the core main areas would be, economics, accounting, finance. There are some other elements, but those would be the main areas. So the CFA and the MBA would certainly help to pursue that. I mean, did I personally pursue that? Not necessarily. I mean, it definitely took me a bit longer to pick up the language and get to where I am. Certainly, taking these courses can help to accelerate one's positioning in that particular environment. Accounting is another one. So I know a few my few of my schoolmates that basically, after they finished, pursued an accounting degree or a post-secondary degree in order to give them sort of those practical skills. And it's interesting too, James and Vivian have obviously mentioned some of their co-op experiences. You know, when I was a student, the accounting program was the only one that really had a co-op program. You know, now there seems to be more co-op programs that are available across a variety of programs at UTSC. But, you know, certainly my sister, who went to U of T as well, took a post-secondary program, as well as some of her other peers. And that practical experience certainly helped position them and as well focus them in terms of a career path, right?
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak about designations or further education?
I think it's huge. I think most people I've seen in economics and development economics, regardless of which area that you want to focus on, kind of like, you know, the different areas, streams that Professor Chandra had mentioned, most often have graduate degrees. But I think really, if you haven't figured it out, then, and I think everybody kind of picks it at their own pace. Like for myself, I haven't pursued it yet, but it is in the back of my mind. But I do want to kind of pick and choose it once I feel like I kind of have to, versus / kind of have a sense of where I want to take it and how I want to pivot my career and kind of use that graduate degree as a pivot, whereas it can also be used as almost an entry point into further career exploration.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We have one final question, and then we'll see where we're at, because we're just about at 7. What can students do right now to help prepare themselves? I know COVID has really changed what that actually does mean, but from your experiences, if you could talk to yourself in that 4th year state, or, you know, just kind of going through school, what could students do to prepare themselves right now? And again, this would be a popcorn question. What advice can you give them?
I guess if I could kick things off, I'd say that the world is so connected now, you know, compared to when Professor Chandra and I were students. Like, I mean, we didn't have smartphones. We didn't have the type of social apps that are there, right? These days, everyone is so connected. You can certainly pick up a lot of information and connect with people that way. You know, attend various Eventbrite or meetups where you could be engaged with people that discuss topics you're interested in, and people from all different sorts of professional backgrounds. So you can basically learn from them and, you know, basically understand what they like about those particular career paths that they've chosen, and see if any of those speak to you, and better understand, okay, well, what steps did they take in order to get there, right? So you know, obviously your involvement participating on this, in this discussion, panel discussion, certainly is a step in that direction. And I would encourage everyone to continue to, you know, get involved in virtual learning, I guess, in this current state. But, you know, when we get out of this pandemic at some point, or when we see some resemblance of what normal is, you know, there are organizations that are out there. And I would certainly encourage you to look at some of those organizations and participate in some of those dialogues, or participate at some of those events where you can network with some of those other people as well. And of course, wouldn't be it would be remiss if I didn't give a plug to, you know, the U of T. Obviously, when I was there, I used the Career Center, right? And certainly the resources there to help sort of give you more insight, more definition in terms of what sort of these careers entailed can also be beneficial to arriving to a conclusion, or at least helping you with your decision making when deciding some of the careers you might want to pursue.
Right. Thank you, Jeff. Anybody else? What final advice can we give for our students tonight?
The only thing I would add, sorry, Lucan, I know you were about to say something, but the only thing I would add, and, you know, obviously I completely agree with Jeff, explore your horizons and learn, take advantage of all these like podcasts and, you know, Clubhouse now and everything. The other thing I would add is, honestly, be willing to take risks and don't be afraid to kind of step outside your comfort zone. I think your first job is not going to define the rest of your career for you. And you're so, like, I'm still young in my career, like you're still young in your career. So it's okay if you make a mistake the first step, but if you're like, hey, I have that like random passion or interest in it, just it's worth exploring.
Thank you. Vivikan, you had something you wanted to say there.
Yeah, I think that both of them really hit the nail on the coffin. Just echoing that. Plus, with the passion piece and the risk, if it makes you feel any better or feel more comfortable taking risks, make calculated risks and make informed decisions. So try to learn as much as you can about the opportunities in front of you and what it entails, what trade-offs there are, like you do in economics. And one thing that I often have done, and I think it's kind of paved the way a lot for me, is just cold messaging people, cold calling people, cold emailing people, and just reaching out to people on LinkedIn. And sometimes that's tough because they are strangers you're speaking to. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to speak to you, even if it's just through messaging, if not a call. But if you're uncomfortable with that, even just reaching out to your own contacts, your own professors, people that you worked with, students, alumni that you meet on panels like this or elsewhere, like reach out to them, show interest, whether you want to speak to them or even somebody else, right? Oftentimes, someone might come to me with a question that I don't have answers to, and I might just redirect them to somebody else that I know. And I think that speaks volumes, and that's happened to me many times. And I think very good way of learning about opportunities and even just having a kind of intellectual exchange or even a casual exchange. So I think just realize that there's a lot in front of you and try to think about the long game as much as you're thinking about what happens tomorrow with your jobs and your careers, because it's just one stepping stone at a time. So yeah, take all of what we've said with a grain of salt, but try to see what works for you and take it from there.
That's great. Professor, do you have any final thoughts for our students? We have one question I'll cover as well, but go ahead, Professor.
No, I think everyone else really, I think summarized it really well. There's maybe one last thing I would say is there's, hopefully many of our students will be lucky enough to have, financially rewarding jobs. So it's really fulfilling to have something else that you do that's not work related. It could be a hobby, but it could also just be giving back to society, especially, we're going to emerge from this pandemic in a world where a lot of people are going to be financially, in desperate situations. And I think there's going to be a lot of room to give back. I know it sounds a bit like a cliche, but there's going to be a lot of room to help people. And doing that actually turns out to be some of the most satisfying things you can do, more satisfying sometimes than your work or your career. So just cultivating that is something I found to be very rewarding.
Thank you so much. We did have one question, which I'll cover. We'll wrap up. Any specific recommendations on books, podcasts, organizations, or resources to help out? So I see there's some things coming in. The Bottom Billion is a book. Okay, so that's something we can look at there. Any other publications, books, or anything that students can look at that you recommend?
I imagine we probably all have a long list. If it helps, Derek, I mean, you have the contact of these students. Maybe we can send you a list after the fact and you can just forward to all of them. Or, I mean, if you guys want to speak about it one-on-one, feel free to kind of reach out. That might be, because nothing's come to my head right off the bat.
Yeah, there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah,
that's a good, as we heard earlier. Back in the day when myself, Mr. Chandra, and Jeff were in school, we didn't have those kind of online resources. Or if you try to go online, remember Netscape? Yeah, right. You go to look up something, 10 minutes later, you might get a response. Today, there's so many resources out there. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at time. All right. It's been 90 minutes. This has been fantastic. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else has as well. It's been great to hear the stories from James, Jeff, Vivikan, and Professor Chandra. Thank you so much for giving up part of your evening. I'm sure the students here very much do appreciate you sharing your stories with them. Hopefully the students here have been able to get some insights, some ideas, a little bit more about economics. That's been fantastic hearing your career stories. And just the common themes that we heard tonight as well. I love that because I've run panels like this before, and it's always nice to, you do hear the common themes of you don't have to have it all figured out when you got the diploma in your hand. And I think we all kind of heard that from everybody here tonight, that you start from somewhere, but you do start, and that's the main thing. So I do want to say thank you so much for that, everybody tonight. That was amazing. Feel free to log off whenever you want. This was great. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a good night. And log off when you feel free, okay? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Good night.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
And everybody's going bye-bye.
Derek, I was just saying, yeah, I think if you want, we can send you maybe a list of some resources to start with, and then you can just send that off to the students, maybe.
Yep, I will send that to the person who's handling this in the back end.
Sure.
and hopefully we have the emails or one that we can send some stuff to for sure. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. James, I'll see you in 3 weeks for our finance one. That'll be great. Dave, again, thank you so much for introducing him. That's great.
Of course.
I appreciate it. Networking in action. Networking
there
in
you go.
action, right?
There you go.
All right, everyone.
Have a good one.
Have a good night.
Bye. You too.